This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hey everyone, if you listened to the previous episode we did about a group of Hopi men who were imprisoned on Alcatraz Island in 1894, you may have heard me make an offhand remark about the story of the Native American activists who occupied Alcatraz in 1969, a century later. And you may have offhandedly heard me say, you know what, we should rerun that episode. So here I am, fulfilling my promise to you. I am, if nothing, a man of my word. But really, we did that episode a while ago, and the two stories do pair nicely. So here is the story of the 1969 Alcatraz occupation from the This Day archives. Take a listen. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 24th, 1969, day 4 of the Alcatraz occupation. So yeah, we're fudging the date a little bit, but it's the beginning of what would end up being a 19-month occupation of Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. On November 20th, 78 American Indians from 20 tribal groups calling themselves the Indians of all tribes took the island, reclaiming it as native land. In case you're wondering, yes, Alcatraz, it was a prison for many decades, but it had been decommissioned, essentially abandoned in 1963, and now this occupation in 1969 was part of a larger Indigenous civil rights movement. Many point to the occupation of Alcatraz as the birth, or certainly one of the key moments in the modern Native American civil rights movement. So here to discuss, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hello, Jody.
And our guest for this episode is Julian Brave Noisecat, journalist and writer, and also one of the forces behind the 50th anniversary commemoration of the Alcatraz occupation that took place last year. So, Julian, thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, this is a pretty obvious question, but we're recording this the week of Thanksgiving. Is that a coincidence, that timing, that this took place the week of Thanksgiving in 1969?
Well, so actually my understanding of the history is that they had a few scouting trips to check out the island, and actually there was a very short-lived occupation that's very rarely remembered in 1964, where a handful of Native activists in the Bay Area actually occupied the island for like a few days. So effectively, I mean, the occupation began in November, according to my sources and my recollection, in part because the Native student activists wanted to sort of jump the gun and get the occupation started. There was a little bit of tension, actually, between the sort of student younger group and some older activists who were also part of the occupation movement. Yeah. And so now, basically, because the occupation's beginning falls pretty close to Thanksgiving every year, on Thanksgiving, or on the day that is Thanksgiving, in the very early morning at sunrise, a group of Native people in the Bay Area and a whole bunch of others actually go to Alcatraz Island to commemorate the occupation.
Yeah. And so why Alcatraz Island?
So one of the leaders of the Indians of all tribes was a Mohawk iron worker and student activist named Richard Oakes. And he has a fairly famous quote where he says that, quote, "Alcatraz is not an island, it's an idea." And the idea was that when you went through New York Harbor on the East Coast, you would encounter the Statue of Liberty, which was a symbol, one symbol of liberty and freedom in the United States. And then when you went through the Golden Gate on the West Coast, you'd encounter Alcatraz, which would be a former federal prison, reclaimed as a symbol of freedom for this country's first peoples. And so it was very much, intentional and symbolic campaign to, reclaim the island. Of course, there were some other elements to it as well. The American Indian Center in San Francisco had burned down not long before the occupation began. So there was also a push to get a cultural center and school on the island, a push that actually has still not been fully realized. But chiefly, I would say, the occupation was hyper-focused on its cultural power and its media significance.
What I love about that is you can already see how neatly this fits into a sort of pattern within civil rights movements, right? The importance of symbolism, the tensions between generations, and the kind of slow build in a way. I mean, I think it's really important that there was this moment in 1964 where an occupation was attempted, and then there's organizing that happens over time. I mean, in 1968, the American Indian Movement, one of these groups that's part of a growing Indigenous rights movement, is founded, and you start to see the organizational framework that precedes this occupation. I think that's such an interesting context in the late 60s.
Well, just to point out that folks who were actually part of the occupation will be quick to say that the American Indian Movement was not one of the leaders of the occupation and actually came in quite late. The group that originally led the occupation was called the Indians of All Tribes, which unfortunately sometimes gets forgotten, but there were certainly different sort of factions and also theories of change. The Indians of All Tribes, for example, was very committed to nonviolence, which was something that the American Indian Movement, probably fair to say, was less committed to.
There's a little bit of a sense of, I don't know if irony is exactly the right word, but there's definitely a sense of like performance in this occupation. I mean, for one, the group offered to buy the land back for $24 in beads and cloth. I'm assuming that was more a symbolic gesture to make a statement than it was an actual transactional offer.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a strong understanding of activism as performance in the very early days of the native rights movement in the late 60s. You know, as you mentioned, when the Indians of All Tribes first occupies Alcatraz, they call a press conference and then present this document, which is kind of cheekily described as, I think, like a statement or proclamation to the Great White Father or something like that, where, you know, they offer to buy Alcatraz for $24 in beads and cloth, which they note was more than what colonists purchased the island of Manhattan for, which is much larger, obviously. They also point out that Alcatraz would be a fitting place and home for native people because it's barren and rocky and you can't grow anything there, like virtually every Indian reservation. And so there's a very strong sense at the very outset of the media and symbolic power of this thing, and you know they're actually quite effective at leveraging that. And you know, again, that sort of symbolic power extends beyond just the Alcatraz occupation and goes into things like the American Indian Movement's occupation of Wounded Knee, which was also a very symbolic stand in the sense that Wounded Knee was the site of probably the most infamous Indian massacre in United States history.
It feels like that media mission takes on an extra potency at this moment because I think part of what the Indigenous rights movement was struggling with was a kind of erasure and invisibility. And if you think about the Termination Act and the attempts by the federal government over the course of the preceding 15 years to dismantle all of these tribes and to take away their federal recognition and to take away their independence, that part of what was being fought for was just visibility and but part of what was being fought for was recognition and visibility and an awareness to non-Indigenous Americans that there are plenty of Indigenous people left, but also that they don't fit the kind of 19th century stereotypes that I think a lot of people still carried around with them.
Yeah, visibility was a huge sort of through line in Native activism at the time, and I'd say still today. You know, there's other famous moments that are tangentially connected to Alcatraz, like when Marlon Brando had Sesshin Littlefeather accept his Oscar at the Oscars. You know, the other piece of this was that, like, the activists were very aware that the strongest sort of card they held was the ability to shape, you know, favorable media narratives around their campaigns. Of course, when Native people represent 1% to 2% of the population, you know, that is sort of the biggest thing that you can leverage. And, you know, what's remarkable in part about the occupation is that you have to remember that this is 1969, And, this is the late 60s, and the tide of American politics is largely turning against movements like the Alcatraz occupation. Richard Nixon gets elected on a platform of law and order, and, sort of the right-wing backlash that is still sort of fairly present in American politics today is really picking up momentum during his presidency. And yet it's Nixon, who officially, transforms the United States official Indian policy from one of termination, which was what it was called. That was the title. That's not like a characterization. That was the official slogan, to one of self-determination, which is the paradigm through which, Indian affairs is still legislated today.
Can you point to this occupation as having an effect on that?
I would say that the occupation played a major role in changing the zeitgeist there. It's not the only thing. The Taos Pueblo, who was, fighting to protect their sacred Blue Lake, was another campaign that was happening at the same time, and also played a really fundamental role in shifting the Nixon administration's policy. There's a number of other campaigns, the fish wars, what are called the fish wars in the northwestern United States, where, tribes who were party to a series of treaties that are called the Stevens Treaties in Washington State were doing a series of what were called fish-ins, where they would exercise their treaty-protected right to fish and would get arrested for it by law enforcement. And then, they used that civil disobedience to eventually sort of roll into a big legal campaign to secure their treaty right to fish. So there's a number of things happening across Indian country at the same time. But Alcatraz is viewed by historians and Native people as the starting point for a lot of that. It's kind of like the Montgomery bus boycott of the Native rights movement, and it plays a really significant sort of igniting role to that fire.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
It does seem as if the decision, whether it was the Nixon administration or a more local California administration, to not, at least at first, remove the protesters is pretty critical. I mean, this goes on, as I said, for 19 months, I think, which was a little surprising as you start to read about it. But also, there were actually attempts to send people out and government officials out to negotiate and to kind of bring this to a peaceable ending. So what is your sense of what the government response was, how that had an impact on the effect of the protest, and then how it started to eventually end after a course of 19 months?
So again, I think that the Nixon administration recognizes that, a group of Native people occupying land that is, for all intents and purposes, not being used by anybody, right? Like the federal prison closes a little under a decade earlier. There's nobody who's utilizing Alcatraz. There's actually even a plan for the island to potentially be transformed into a casino by a developer. And, I think the Nixon administration recognizes that this is this is a story that will be viewed very sympathetically by journalists and then by a large, portion of the public. And I think that sort of colors that shades their negotiations accordingly. They really don't want to be put in a position where they're going in forcefully and removing people. That they know that that's not going to look particularly good. And, to their credit, the Indians of all tribes also knows that's one of their stronger sort of negotiating positions and tactics. And so instead what they do is, they basically try to wait out the occupation. Of course, the occupation is logistically really, really hard to sustain. You need to have, a fleet of essentially allied boats in the Bay Area that are bringing supplies and people back and forth. They do at one point set up a Coast Guard sort of perimeter to try to keep that from happening. There's all sorts of sort of older Bay Area, liberal hippie types who have stories of, running supplies and other things to the occupiers.
Is it where we point out that the band Creedence Clearwater Revival apparently donated a boat to transport supplies back and forth?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of crazy stories like that. There's also one of the people who actually supported the 50th and the canoe journey that we organized for that. She would navigate her sailboat in darkness through the perimeter to bring supplies to the occupiers. But if, eventually, and as these things tend to go, factions develop within the occupation, and those sorts of fissures and divisions end up working to the, law enforcement and the Nixon administration's advantage. And basically they just sort of wait those things out until the occupation sort of loses steam and dwindles and the media moves on. And then eventually, the thing comes to a not particularly climactic conclusion.
And they did at some point cut off water and electricity to the island as well. So I think, there was some of that going on.
Right.
I love the parallel with the Montgomery bus boycott because that, too, was a very lengthy protest that, went on for a year, maybe a little more than a year. And I think that the point about the sympathetic nature of the protesters is really important here because that's one of the lessons of the 60s that I think someone like Nixon, who was a savvy politician, had learned by 1969, that whenever he turned somebody into a target, he picked the least sympathetic person possible. He was much more likely to go after those California hippies who were helping out rather than the native peoples who were occupying Alcatraz because he didn't want those images flooding the airwaves. So I think that so much of this is lessons learned over the course of those 15 years of activism, both by activists but also by the people who we're trying to figure out how best to navigate the politics of activism.
As we start to wrap up here, I'm curious if you can spin this a little forward. And, obviously we've been talking about the symbolic nature of this and this being, a key moment. But are there, tactically any lessons from the Alcatraz occupation that are still being used among indigenous rights groups or protests? I mean, what is the more tangible legacy of this occupation?
I would put my finger on probably a few, maybe three of them. So the first is, treaty rights, sovereignty, self-determination as the defining through line in indigenous politics and activism, which is maintained to this day and certainly did not start with Alcatraz, but Alcatraz is a catalyzing force for that nationally and even beyond. A second would be occupying land and territory as a purposeful strategy that's particularly relevant in the indigenous context where the return of land, self-governance, and sovereignty is sort of the primary objective of the vast majority of campaigns. You see a pretty similar tactic employed in the movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example. And then lastly, again, I think that the power of symbols, culture, and the media essentially viewing activism as potentially to a certain extent, performance art is really, really important. There are a few stories as culturally powerful in United States history as, the sort of cowboys and Indians narrative. And throughout sort of the history of Native activism, that image has been quite playfully and successfully sort of leveraged to Native people's advantage.
Yeah, that ability to tap into tropes and stereotypes and flip them on their head, or even to tap into the three things that most Americans know about Indigenous history and use them in a really politically effective way, I think is one of the takeaways from the Alcatraz occupation, because it's I love the word playful there because it is exactly that. It's not just politics, but there's this joy and lightness to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a pretty sophisticated view of what activism and protest can be. Certainly, as someone who's fairly politically engaged and participates in social movements, I still think that there are actually lessons that can be gleaned for contemporary activism from the Indians of all tribes occupation.
Julian Brave Noisecat, thank you so much for doing this. This has been really, really interesting.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And thanks to you, Nicole Hemmer.
Thank you, Jody.
All right, there you have it. And of course, if you haven't gone back and listened to our previous story earlier this week about the Hopi men imprisoned on Alcatraz in 1894, go check it out or dive into the This Day archives. We are on our 4th trip around the calendar at this point. There is a lot for you to explore. But we will be back with a brand new episode on Sunday, so I'll see you then. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.